The letter came on the same afternoon that Silas Hargrove threatened to take her store, and Naomi Wainwright would later wonder if it was God's timing or just the plain cruelty of coincidence that both things arrived in her life within an hour of each other. It was the spring of 1879, and the town of Cottonwood Bend, Kansas, sat baking under a sky so pale it looked bleached by the wind that never stopped blowing across the plains. Naomi stood behind the counter of Wainwright's General Store, the same counter her late husband Thomas had built with his own hands the year they married, and listened to Hargrove's boots creak against the floorboards as he studied the ledger she had pushed toward him with trembling fingers. $62 past due, Mrs. Wainwright, he said, not looking up. He was a heavy man with a mustache waxed too carefully for a banker in a dust-choked town, and he smelled always of pomade and self-satisfaction. The bank has been patient. I have been patient. The winter took the wheat, Naomi said. You know that as well as I do, Mr. Hargrove. Every farmer in this county lost half his crop. Every farmer in this county is not 3 payments behind on a mortgage. He closed the ledger with a snap that made her flinch. I will need something by the 1st of June, or the bank will have no choice but to foreclose. I would hate to see that happen to you, of all people. His eyes moved over her in a way that made her skin crawl, the way a man looks over a horse he intends to purchase cheap because its owner has no other buyers. Unless, of course, we might find some other arrangement. There is no other arrangement, Mr. Hargrove. He had smiled, then tipped his hat, and left her standing alone in the dim store with the smell of coffee beans and kerosene, and the terrible arithmetic of her situation pressing down on her chest like a stone. It was into that silence that her Aunt Verna came bustling through the back door, cheeks pink with the wind, waving an envelope over her head like a woman waving off a fire. Naomi, Naomi, a letter has come for you, all the way from Wyoming Territory. I don't know anyone in Wyoming Territory, Naomi said, and took the envelope with more suspicion than curiosity. The handwriting was careful, a man's hand trying hard to be neat, the ink a little too dark in places where the pen had paused too long. Well, you do now, Verna said, and there was something in her voice, a certain brightness that did not sit quite right, though Naomi did not think much of it at the time. She was 27 years old, widowed 14 months, and tired in a way that made her slow to notice the small deceptions of people who loved her. She opened the letter standing right there at the counter, because there was nowhere else quiet enough to sit, not with the store still needing tending and the dust still needing sweeping and the whole weight of Thomas's debt still needing carrying on her narrow shoulders. Dear Mrs. Wainwright, it began, in that careful hand. My name is Patrick Walker. I run cattle on a small spread outside of Laramie, in the Wyoming Territory, and I confess I do not rightly know how to begin a letter such as this, having never written one like it before. I saw your name and a few words about your circumstances printed in the matrimonial paper that comes through here from Kansas City, and though I understand that paper is meant for men looking for wives and women looking for husbands, I do not write to you today looking for a bride. I write only because something in the notice, the little that was said of you, put me in mind of my own mother, who was widowed young and left to run a store much like the one you keep, and who never had an easy day of it after my father passed. I do not know your troubles, ma'am, and I would not presume to guess at them. But I know something of what it is to watch a woman you love work herself thin trying to hold together what a good man left behind, and I thought, well, perhaps a stranger's kind word costs nothing and might be worth something anyway. So here is mine. I hope the winter has not been too hard on you, and I hope whatever you are facing, you have people around you who see your worth, because from the little that was written of you, it seems plain that you have carried more than your share. If you would rather not write back, I understand entirely, and no offense will be taken. But if a letter now and then from a stranger in Wyoming would be welcome, I would be glad to send them. Respectfully yours, Patrick Walker. Naomi read it twice, standing at the counter with the dust motes turning gold in the slant of afternoon light through the front window, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight since Thomas died loosened just slightly, the way a fist relaxes when it finally realizes there is nothing left to hold on to. "Aunt Verna," she said slowly, "did you put my name in a matrimonial paper?" Verna, suddenly very interested in straightening a display of canned peaches, did not turn around. "I may have mentioned to Reverend Bell's wife that you were a fine, hard-working young widow who deserved better than what this town has given her. If she wrote a little notice and sent it off to Kansas City, well, that is hardly a crime. Aunt Verna, you are not getting any younger, Naomi, and this store is not going to save itself, and I will not stand by and watch you become an old, tired woman before you have even had the chance to be a young, happy one." Verna finally turned around, her eyes suspiciously bright. "It was one notice. If nothing comes of it, nothing comes of it. But something has already come of it, hasn't it? I can see it in your face." Naomi looked down at the letter again. There was nothing improper in it, nothing forward or foolish. It was simply kind, the kind of kindness she had not been offered by anyone but her aunt in over a year, and something about a stranger 1,000 miles away thinking of his mother when he read a few printed lines about her troubles made her throat tighten in a way she had not expected. "I will write back," she said finally, "as a kindness, nothing more than that." "Of course," said Verna, who did not believe that for one moment but was wise enough not to say so. Naomi wrote her reply that same night by candlelight at the small table in the back room where she took her meals since Thomas died, because the front room still felt too much like a place where two people used to sit. "Dear Mr. Walker, thank you for your letter. I confess I did not know my circumstances had been made public in a matrimonial paper, and I suspect my aunt has some explaining to do on that account, but I do not fault you for reading and responding kindly to what you found there. It has been a hard year. My husband Thomas passed of a fever last winter, and I have been left to keep our store going through a drought that has emptied half the farms in this county of their crops and their hope in equal measure. I do not say this to earn your pity, only because you were honest with me, and I think honesty deserves the same in return. I do not know that I am in any position to think of marriage, Mr. Walker, and I would not want you to write to me under some misunderstanding of my intentions, but I will say that your letter was a kindness on a day that had precious little kindness in it otherwise, and I find I do not want to leave that kindness unanswered. If you would like to write again, as a friend and nothing more, I think I would like that. I hope your cattle fared well through the winter, and that Wyoming has been gentler to you than Kansas has been to me. Sincerely, Naomi Wainwright. She sent it the next morning with the stagecoach mail, and told herself firmly that it was nothing, a small politeness exchanged between strangers who would likely never lay eyes on one another. And then she went back to the business of trying to keep her store from being swallowed whole by the bank. The weeks that followed were hard ones. The drought did not break. Farmers came into the store less and less, and when they did come, they came to ask for credit rather than to spend coin. And Naomi, who could not bear to turn away a family with hungry children even when her own ledger screamed at her to do so, extended credit she knew she might never see repaid. Hargrove came by twice more, each time a little less patient, each time his eyes lingering a little longer on her in that way that made her want to scrub her skin afterward. "You ought to just marry him and be done with it," said old Mrs. Prout, who ran the boarding house across the street and had opinions about everything. "He would forgive the debt in a heartbeat if you gave him reason to." "I would sooner sell the store to a stranger and start over with nothing," Naomi said, and meant it. It was during this stretch in the last week of April that the second letter came. She recognized the handwriting before she even read the return address, and something in her, some small, foolish, hopeful thing she had thought long buried with Thomas, gave a little leap at the sight of it. She waited until the store was closed and the candles were lit before she let herself open it, wanting to give it the quiet it seemed to deserve. "Dear Mrs. Wainwright, I have read your letter more times than I care to admit, and I have thought long about how to say what I mean to say next, because I am afraid that once I say it, I cannot unsay it, and you may think less of me for the saying. But I have never been a man comfortable with half-truths, and I find I cannot go on writing to you as though there is not something you deserve to know. Some months back, before I ever wrote to you, before I ever saw your name printed in that paper, I had occasion to pass through Cottonwood Bend on a cattle drive north out of Texas. We stopped only 2 nights to rest the herd and take on supplies, and it was in those 2 nights that I heard talk in the saloon of a young widow keeping a store on her own, in debt to the bank, being pressed hard by a man named Hargrove who seemed to want more from her than money. I did not know your name then. I did not know your face. I only heard men speak of a hard situation, and a woman handling it with more grace than she was likely given credit for, and something about it sat poorly with me, the way certain things do when a man has seen enough hardship in his own life to recognize it in someone else's. I am not a wealthy man, Mrs. Wainwright, but I have had good years with my cattle, and I had some money set by that I did not need for anything in particular. Before I left Cottonwood Bend, I went to your bank and I paid $60 against an account under the name Wainwright, and I asked the clerk not to say from whom it had come, only that it was a gift and not a loan, and that no one need trouble themselves over who had given it. I did not do this to purchase your gratitude, and I certainly did not do it thinking that one day I would be writing you letters and calling myself, however hopefully, your friend. I did it because it seemed the right thing to do, and I have tried in my life to do the right thing when I am able, whether or not anyone ever knows my name for it. But I find now that I cannot in good conscience keep writing to you, getting to know you through your letters, letting you think well of a stranger's kindness, without telling you that the kindness began before you ever knew my name. I would rather you be angry with me for the telling than have you learn it some other way, and think I had been keeping secrets for my own purposes. If this changes how you feel about writing to me, I will understand, and I will trouble you no further. But I wanted you to know the truth of it whatever comes after. Yours, Patrick Walker. Naomi sat very still for a long moment after she finished reading, the candle flickering low beside her, and then she set the letter down on the table with hands that were not quite steady, and she sat down in the chair across from where she had been standing, though she had not realized until that moment that she had been standing at all. She sat there for a very long time. The $60. She remembered the day the bank had told her the balance had been reduced, remembered how confused she had been, how the clerk had only shrugged and said an anonymous payment had come in months before that had simply not been applied until the quarterly reckoning caught it up. She had thought it some clerical error in her favor, had thanked God quietly and moved on, too consumed with the day-to-day fight of keeping her doors open to question a stroke of good fortune too closely. It had not been an error. It had been a stranger, a cowboy passing through on a cattle drive, who had heard talk of her troubles in a saloon and had simply decided, without asking anything in return, without even knowing her face, to help. She thought of Hargrove's eyes moving over her like she was livestock to be acquired. She thought of the exhausting arithmetic of her days, the endless calculating of what she could spare and what she could not. And she thought of a man 1,000 miles away who had given away $60 of his own hard-earned money to a woman he had never met, for no reason except that it seemed the right thing to do. Verna found her still sitting there an hour later, the candle burned down to a stub, and asked what on earth was wrong. "Nothing is wrong," Naomi said, and her voice came out strange even to her own ears. "Everything is exactly the opposite of wrong, Aunt Verna. I think I have just learned something about the kind of man Patrick Walker is." She wrote her reply the very next morning, before the store even opened, sitting at the counter with the morning light coming pale and gold through the front window. "Dear Mr. Walker, I do not know quite how to begin this letter either, so I think I will simply begin. I remember the day the bank told me my balance had been reduced. I thought it a clerical error, a stroke of luck I did not question because I could not afford to question good fortune when it came, however strangely. I did not know, could not have known that it was you, A man I had never met. A man who had heard talk in a saloon of a woman he had never seen, and decided that her troubles were worth $60 of his own money, with no expectation of thanks, no expectation of anything at all. I sat for a very long time after I read your letter, Mr. Walker. I am not sure I can properly explain to you what it did to something in me that has been closed up tight since my husband died. I have spent the better part of a year being looked at by men in this town as either an object of pity or an object of opportunity, and here was a stranger who looked at nothing at all, not my face, not my situation, only my name in a newspaper column, and decided I was worth kindness anyway. You asked whether this changes how I feel about writing to you. It does change something, Mr. Walker, though not in the way you feared. It makes me want to know you a great deal more than I did before, and it makes me ashamed that I told you in my last letter that I could not think of anything beyond friendship. I find I am thinking of a good many things beyond friendship now, though I hardly know what to do with such thoughts, given that we have never so much as shaken hands. Tell me about your ranch. Tell me about your mother and your father, and how you came to be a man who gives away $60 to strangers because it seemed the right thing to do. I find I want to know everything. With more warmth than I intended to show, Naomi Wainwright. The letters that followed came fast and thick through that summer, faster than the mail coach schedule seemed to properly allow, though Naomi began to suspect Patrick was riding the extra miles into Laramie himself, just to catch the earlier post rather than waiting for it to come to him. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, the son of a blacksmith who had died when Patrick was 12, leaving his mother to run a small dry goods store much as Naomi ran hers now. She learned that he had fought for the Union in the war, had been wounded once at a place called Pea Ridge, had come west afterward because there was nothing left for him in Missouri and everything, it seemed, waiting for him beyond the Mississippi. She learned that he had built his ranch from nothing over 12 years, starting with 40 head of cattle bought on credit, and a dugout he had carved into a hillside with his own 2 hands, and that he now ran better than 2,000 head across land he had bought fair and square from the government, land he loved with a ferocity that came through in every letter. When he described the way the light fell across the Laramie plains at sunset, or the sound the wind made moving through the grass in autumn. She learned that he had never married, not for lack of interest from the women in the territory, but because he had been too busy building something worth offering a wife before he felt he had the right to ask for one. I did not want to bring a woman out here to nothing, he wrote. I wanted to have something built first, something worth the asking. I suppose I have been waiting a long time without quite knowing what, or who, I was waiting for. For her part, Naomi found herself writing things to Patrick Walker that she had never said aloud to another living soul, not even to Verna. She wrote about the loneliness of running a store alone, the particular grief of sleeping in a bed that still smelled faintly of her husband's shaving soap 8 months after he was gone. She wrote about her fear that Hargrove would eventually win, that the store would be lost, that she would end up exactly the kind of desperate, dependent woman she had sworn as a girl she would never become. You will not lose that store, Patrick wrote back, with a certainty that startled her. And if by some misfortune you did, I want you to know that would not be the end of anything for you. A woman with your grit could build a life anywhere. I have seen it in every letter you have written me. You are not the kind of woman who breaks, Mrs. Wainwright. I have known that since the first letter you sent me. By July, she had stopped signing her letters sincerely and started signing them simply Naomi. By August, his letters no longer began Dear Mrs. Wainwright but Dear Naomi, and something in the way those 2 words looked on the page in his careful hand made her press the letter to her chest before she had even finished reading the rest of it. It was Verna who finally said what Naomi had not yet allowed herself to think plainly. You are in love with that man, Verna said one evening, watching Naomi read a letter for the 3rd time by the fire. I have never even seen his face, Naomi said, though she did not deny it. Your mother never saw your father's face either, not before they were promised. Sometimes love comes through the words first and the face comes after. It does not make it any less real." Naomi did not answer, but she did not argue either. And later that night she wrote a letter that ended with the words, "I find myself wishing, more than is perhaps wise, that I could see your face and hear your voice, and know for certain whether the man I have come to know on paper is the same man who exists in the flesh. Is that a foolish thing to wish for, Patrick?" His answer came back 3 weeks later, and it was shorter than his usual letters, but it made her heart pound harder than any of the long, thoughtful ones that had come before. "It is not foolish at all, Naomi. I have been wishing the same thing since your very first letter, and I have finally worked up the courage to say so. My herd is settled for the season, and I have a foreman I trust to manage things in my absence. If you would permit it, I would like to come to Cottonwood Bend. Not to press you into anything you are not ready for, but simply to meet you, to see for myself the woman whose letters have become the best part of my days. I could be there by the second week of September if the trains run as they ought. Tell me if I am wanted and I will come." Naomi read that letter standing in the exact spot where she had read his first one, and she found herself laughing and crying at once, a strange, wild happiness bubbling up in her chest that she had not felt in so long she had nearly forgotten what it was called. "He is coming," she told Verna, who was already halfway to the door to tell Mrs. Prout and anyone else who would listen. "Of course he is," Verna said. "I knew it the day I sent that notice to the paper." But the summer had not been kind to Naomi in every respect, and even as her heart lifted with the promise of Patrick Walker's arrival, the ground beneath her feet had grown no more solid. Hargrove had grown bolder in his visits, and by August his patience, such as it was, had run entirely out. "The bank has decided it can extend you no further credit, Mrs. Wainwright," he told her one hot afternoon, standing too close in the doorway of her store, blocking the light. "The full balance is due by the 15th of September, or the property reverts to the bank, as per the terms of your husband's original mortgage. That is barely a month, Mr. Hargrove. You know I cannot raise that sum in a month. I know it very well." He smiled, and there was nothing pleasant in it. "Which is why I am prepared to offer you an alternative. Marry me, Mrs. Wainwright, and the debt disappears entirely. I will even let you keep running your little store, if that is what pleases you, though I confess I cannot see why a woman would want to work so hard when she need not." Naomi felt something cold and furious rise in her chest. "I would rather lose everything I own than marry you, Mr. Hargrove." His smile did not falter, but something behind his eyes went flat and mean. "That can certainly be arranged, ma'am. The 15th of September. I would suggest you spend the time between now and then thinking very carefully about your options, because I do not believe you have as many as you think." He left, and Naomi stood alone in her store shaking with a rage that had nowhere to go, because there was nothing to be done, no law that would help her, no one in this town with the power or the will to stand against a man who owned the only bank for 40 miles. The 15th of September. Patrick was set to arrive the second week of September. She would meet the man she had fallen in love with through letters only days before she might lose everything she had left of the life she had built with Thomas. She wrote to Patrick that night, and for the first time since their correspondence began, she told him the whole truth of her situation without softening a single edge of it, because she found she no longer had the strength to pretend everything might simply work itself out. "I do not tell you this to ask for money, Patrick, and if you offer it I think I might refuse it, because I could not bear for what is between us to become tangled up in dollars and debts on top of everything else. I only tell you because I promised myself I would not keep secrets from you, not after everything you told me about the $60. I do not know what will happen come the 15th of September. I only know that whatever it is, I would rather face it having been honest with you than not." His reply came faster than any letter yet, arriving by special messenger rather than the regular post, as though he could not bear the extra days the mail coach would have cost. "I'm coming sooner than planned, Naomi. I will be on the first train I can manage, and I will be in Cottonwood Bend well before the 15th. Whatever Hargrove intends, he will find he is not dealing only with a widow alone anymore. I am not a rich man, but I am not a poor one either, and I did not build a ranch from 40 head of cattle over 12 years by being a man who backs down from bullies in bankers' suits. Hold on a little longer. I am coming. The train from Laramie to Cottonwood Bend required 2 changes and the better part of 3 days, and Naomi counted every hour of it, marking the days on the calendar that hung behind her counter with small, careful pencil strokes, as though the counting itself might make the time pass faster. On the morning of the 9th of September, 6 days before Hargrove's deadline, the noon train pulled into the small depot at the edge of town in a cloud of steam and cinders, and Naomi stood on the platform with her heart hammering so hard she thought the whole town must surely hear it. She had never seen his face. She had built one in her mind from the shape of his handwriting and the tone of his words, and she realized, watching the passengers step down one by one, that she had no earthly idea what she was looking for, only that she would know him the moment she saw him, the way you know a thing that has already become familiar through some sense other than sight. And then he was there. He was taller than she had imagined, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had spent his life working with his hands, with sun-browned skin, and a face that was more weathered than handsome in any conventional sense. But there was something in his eyes, a warmth and an openness, that struck her the moment they found hers across the platform, and she understood at once, without a single word passing between them, that this was the man who had written every one of those letters with his own true heart laid bare on the page. He stopped a few feet from her, hat in his hands, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "Mrs. Wainwright," he said finally, and his voice was lower and rougher than she had imagined, but kind, so achingly kind. "Naomi, I would know you anywhere. I do not know how, but I would." "Patrick," she said, and found she had no other words ready, only his name, which felt like the truest thing she had said in a very long time. He smiled then, and it transformed his whole weathered face into something almost boyish, and he stepped forward and took her hand in both of his, careful and reverent, as though she were something precious he was afraid of dropping. "I have thought about this moment for months," he said, "and I find every word I planned to say has gone clean out of my head." "Then perhaps we should not say anything for a moment," Naomi said, laughing despite the tears that had risen unbidden to her eyes, "and simply stand here and be glad of it." They stood there together on the platform for a long moment while the train hissed and settled behind them, and the rest of the world went on about its business. And Naomi thought that she had never in her life felt so entirely, terrifyingly certain of anything as she felt certain, standing there with her hand in his, that this man was going to change the whole shape of her life. They walked together toward the town, Patrick carrying his single traveling bag over one shoulder, and she told him everything that had not fit into letters, the small daily texture of her fear about Hargrove and the 15th of September, and he listened with his jaw set tight, and his eyes hard in a way that made her understand, more clearly than any letter could have, that this was a man who did not take injustice lightly. "He cannot simply take a widow's home because she will not marry him," Patrick said. "There must be something that can be done. I have asked the sheriff. Ezra Combs is a decent man, but Hargrove holds the mortgage note, legal and proper, signed by Thomas before he died. There is nothing improper in calling the debt due. The only impropriety is in the manner he has gone about collecting it, and that is not the kind of thing a court concerns itself with." Patrick was quiet for a moment, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust as they walked. "Then we will simply have to make certain the debt is not there to collect. Patrick, I told you, I will not have you throwing money at my troubles the way you threw it at me before we ever met. I am not talking about a gift, Naomi." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully, and there was something steady and certain in his expression that made her breath catch. I have money set by from 12 years of good cattle prices, money I have been saving without quite knowing what I was saving it for. I would like to pay off the mortgage on your store, not as charity, but as a business matter between two people who intend, if you will have me, to build a life together. I did not come 3 days by train to watch you lose everything to a man like Hargrove, while I stand by with the means to stop it. You are asking to marry me before you have even known me a full hour in person, Naomi said, though her voice had gone soft and unsteady. I am not asking anything yet, Patrick said gently. I am telling you what I hope for and what I am prepared to do regardless of your answer, because no woman should lose her home to a man like that, whether or not she ever chooses me. But I will say, Naomi, that I have known you for months. I have known you through every letter, through every fear and every hope you have put down on paper for me to read. I do not need more time to know my own heart. I only wonder whether you need more time to trust it. Naomi looked up at this man, this stranger who was not a stranger at all, standing in the dusty street of Cottonwood Bend with the September sun beating down and the whole weight of her future balanced somewhere in the space between them, and she felt something settle inside her, quiet and certain, like a door closing gently on a room she no longer needed to visit. I do not need more time, she said. I have spent all the time I need reading your letters and learning the shape of your heart. I only need to know that you are not simply trying to rescue a woman in trouble because it is in your nature to do so, the way you paid that debt before you ever knew my name. Naomi. He reached up and touched her cheek, the first time he had touched her at all beyond the taking of her hand, and his fingers were rough and careful all at once. I paid that debt for a stranger because it seemed the right thing to do. I am standing here now, asking to spend my life with you because I have fallen in love with the woman behind that stranger's troubles, letter by letter, until I could not imagine my days without her words in them. Those are not the same thing. I would hope you know the difference. I do, she said, and her voice broke on the words. I have known it since your second letter, Patrick. I sat down for the longest time after I read it, and I have not really stood back up since, not all the way. Some part of me has been sitting there ever since, waiting for you to arrive and finish whatever it was you started. He kissed her then, gently, right there in the street where anyone might see, and Naomi Wainwright, who had told herself for 14 long months that she had no more room in her heart for anything but grief and survival, found that her heart had apparently made room all on its own, quietly, letter by letter, without asking her permission at all. News of Patrick Walker's arrival spread through Cottonwood Bend faster than a prairie fire, as such things always did in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business better than their own. Mrs. Prout declared him a fine figure of a man within the hour, having watched him carry his own bag rather than hire a boy to do it, which she took as evidence of good character. Reverend Bell's wife, who had written the original matrimonial notice without ever confessing it to Naomi directly, could not stop smiling every time she passed the store, as though she personally had orchestrated the whole romance from beginning to end, which in a small way she supposed she had. Silas Hargrove heard the news by that evening, and he did not smile at all. He came to the store the following morning and found Patrick there ahead of him, standing behind the counter beside Naomi as though he had already claimed his place there, and something in Hargrove's expression curdled at the sight. I did not realize Mrs. Wainwright kept company with drifters, he said, his voice smooth but with an edge beneath it. Patrick Walker is no drifter, Naomi said, before Patrick could answer for himself. He owns a ranch of over 2,000 head outside Laramie, and he has come to discuss the settling of my mortgage. Hargrove's smile flickered, just slightly. The mortgage is a matter between the bank and Mrs. Wainwright. The mortgage, Patrick said, stepping forward and setting a folded bank draft on the counter with a deliberate, quiet weight, is a matter of dollars and cents. Mr. Hargrove, and dollars and cents are a language I speak very well. That draft covers the full balance owed, principal and any legitimate interest accrued, drawn on the Stockman's Bank of Laramie, which I believe you will find to be a solvent and reputable institution. I would ask that you have your bank issue a formal release of the mortgage note by the end of the week." Hargrove picked up the draft with 2 fingers as though it might be counterfeit and studied it for a long moment. Naomi watched his face move through several expressions: disbelief, calculation, and finally something like defeat, before he set it back down. "This is highly irregular," he said. "There is nothing irregular about a debt being paid in full," Patrick said evenly. "Unless you had some other arrangement in mind for Mrs. Wainwright's future that had less to do with money and more to do with pressuring a widow into a marriage she did not want. In which case, Mr. Hargrove, I would say it is you who has been irregular, and I would think very carefully before you trouble this lady again." There was a long, taut silence in the store, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall and the faint creak of the floorboards under Hargrove's shifting weight. "I have never done anything improper," Hargrove said finally, though his voice had lost its earlier smoothness. "Then you have nothing to fear from a bank draft and a quiet Tuesday morning," Patrick said. "Good day, Mr. Hargrove." Hargrove left without another word, and Naomi found herself laughing, a wild, relieved, disbelieving laugh, once the door had closed behind him. "I cannot believe you actually did that," she said. "I told you I did not want you throwing money at my troubles." "I did not throw money at your troubles, Naomi. I settled a debt with a man who had no business using it as a weapon against you, and I did it as your intended, not as a stranger performing charity. There is a difference, and I think you know it." "My intended," she repeated softly, testing the word. "If you will have me," Patrick said, suddenly looking less certain than he had a moment before, as though the enormity of what he had just done and what he was now asking had only just caught up with him. "I do not mean to presume, Naomi. I know it has only been 2 days since you first saw my face. I am prepared to court you properly, to wait as long as you need, to prove myself to you in the flesh the way I hope I have already begun to prove myself on paper. I only wanted Hargrove gone from your life for good, whatever you decide about me." Naomi came around the counter and took both his hands in hers. "Patrick Walker, I have been falling in love with you since your second letter. I do not need to be courted properly for months to know my own heart, any more than you needed months to know yours. I would be glad, more glad than I know how to say, to be your intended. And eventually, if you will still want me once the newness of my face has worn off, your wife." He kissed her again then, longer this time, with the store empty and quiet around them and the September sun slanting warm through the front windows. And somewhere outside a wagon rattled past, and a dog barked at nothing in particular, and the ordinary sounds of Cottonwood Bend went on exactly as they always had, entirely unaware that inside the general store, 2 people who had fallen in love through ink and paper had just decided in the flesh to build the rest of their lives together. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, on a clear October morning with the cottonwoods along the creek turned gold and the wind, for once, gentle rather than punishing. Reverend Bell performed the ceremony in the small white church at the end of Main Street, and half the town turned out, partly out of genuine affection for Naomi and partly, Naomi suspected with some amusement, out of curiosity to lay eyes on the cowboy from Wyoming who had paid off a widow's mortgage before he had ever met her face to face. A story that had by then grown into something of a local legend, told and retold with increasing embellishment at the boarding house and the barber shop alike. Verna cried through the entire ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and telling everyone within earshot that she had known it would happen since the very day she sent that notice to the matrimonial paper, a claim that grew bolder with each retelling until, by the time of the wedding supper, she had convinced herself and half the guests that she had personally arranged the entire romance through sheer force of intuition. Naomi wore her mother's wedding dress, taken in at the waist and let out at the hem, and when she walked down the short aisle of the church toward Patrick, standing tall and freshly shaved in a borrowed suit that did not quite fit his broad shoulders, she found she was not thinking of Thomas at all. Not with grief, only with a quiet gratitude that the life she had built with him, however brief, had led her here to this church, to this man, to this particular, unlikely happiness that she had never expected to find again. Do you, Naomi Wainwright, take this man, Patrick Walker, to be your lawful husband, Reverend Bell said, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, so long as you both shall live? I do, Naomi said, and her voice did not shake at all, though her heart was pounding hard enough that she was certain Patrick must be able to hear it. And do you, Patrick Walker, take this woman, Naomi Wainwright, to be your lawful wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, so long as you both shall live? I do, Patrick said, and he said it looking directly into her eyes, with a certainty that seemed to settle over the whole small church like sunlight breaking through cloud. They decided, after much discussion in the weeks leading up to the wedding, that they would not choose between the ranch in Wyoming and the store in Kansas, but would find some way to keep both, at least for a while. Patrick's foreman, a steady, capable man named Curtis Odell, who had worked the ranch for 6 years and knew its rhythms as well as Patrick himself, agreed to manage the daily operations through the winter while Patrick and Naomi settled matters in Cottonwood Bend, and it was decided that come spring, once the store's finances were fully in order and a reliable manager could be found to run it, Naomi would sell the business or lease it, whichever suited best. And the two of them would make their permanent home on the ranch outside Laramie. Verna, for her part, declared she had no intention of being left behind in Kansas, while her niece went off to live among cowboys and cattle, and by the following spring she too had packed her belongings and moved west with them, taking up residence in a small house Patrick had built near the main ranch house, close enough to visit daily but far enough, as she put it herself with a wink, to give young married people their proper privacy. The store was sold that spring to a young couple newly arrived from Ohio, eager to make their start in Kansas, and Naomi found that saying goodbye to it was easier than she had expected, not because the place had not mattered to her, but because she had already built something new to hold in her heart, something that made room for the old grief and the new joy both, without either one needing to crowd out the other. Life on the Walker Ranch was not easy, not in the way a woman raised in a Kansas storefront might have imagined easy to look. There were blizzards in the winter that buried the bunkhouse to its windows, and cattle to be pulled from mud in the spring thaw, and long days in summer when Naomi rode out with Patrick simply, because she preferred his company to being alone in the ranch house, learning slowly the rhythms of a life so different from anything she had known, learning to ride properly, to help with branding, to keep the ranch's own small ledger with the same careful hand she had once kept her father's store accounts. But it was, she found, a good hard, the kind of hard that built something rather than wore something away, and every evening when the work was done and the sun went down gold and orange over the Laramie plains exactly as Patrick had described it in his letters so long ago, she would sit with him on the porch of the house he had built with his own hands, and think that she had never in her life felt so entirely at home anywhere as she felt sitting beside this man, watching the light fade over land they had chosen together to call their own. Their first son was born the following winter, in January of 1881, during a snowstorm so fierce that Patrick had to ride 4 miles through the drifts himself to fetch the midwife from a neighboring ranch, arriving back just in time. They named him Thomas, after Naomi's first husband, a choice Patrick suggested himself without any hint of jealousy or reluctance, because, as he told her simply, a man who was kind to you deserves to be remembered kindly, and there is room enough in a good life for more than one love to be honored. Naomi wept when he said it, not from sadness, but from the particular tenderness of being married to a man capable of such generosity of spirit, a man who had first shown her his character not through grand gestures, but through a quiet gift of $60 to a woman he had never met, and who had gone on showing her that same character in 1,000 small ways ever since. Their second child, a daughter they named Verna after the aunt who had, however deviously, brought them together, was born 2 years later, in the autumn of 1883, on a day when the cottonwoods along the creek that ran through the ranch had turned the same gold they had been the day of the wedding. A detail Naomi noted with a smile, as she held her daughter for the first time and thought of how strange and wonderful it was that a life could turn so entirely on the small kindness of a stranger's letter. Old Verna, holding her tiny namesake for the first time, declared with great satisfaction that she had known, from the very first moment she sent that notice to the matrimonial paper, that something extraordinary would come of it, and this time no one in the room, not even Patrick, had the heart to argue with her, because by then it seemed almost true enough not to matter whether it had actually been so. Silas Hargrove, they later heard through the occasional letter from Mrs. Prout, who kept up a faithful correspondence with Naomi long after the move to Wyoming, had lost his position at the bank 2 years after the wedding, following an investigation into irregular lending practices that had ensnared several other widows and desperate farmers in the county, men and women who had not had a cowboy from Wyoming to ride to their rescue. Naomi felt a complicated grief on their behalf when she heard it, a reminder that her own happy ending had been, in some part, a matter of luck as much as love, that not every woman facing what she had faced found a Patrick Walker waiting at the end of it, and she made certain, in the years that followed, to speak up loudly whenever she heard of similar injustice being done to women in her new community. Unwilling to let the memory of what she had nearly lost fade into simple gratitude, without also becoming a kind of resolve. The ranch prospered through the 1880s, weathering the hard winter of 1886 and 1887 that broke so many other outfits across the territory, in part because Patrick had always run his herd more conservatively than his neighbors, keeping fewer cattle better fed rather than chasing the larger numbers that ruined so many ranchers when the deep snows came, and there was no feed laid up to see the animals through. Naomi took over much of the bookkeeping for the operation as the years went on, her old skills from the store proving unexpectedly valuable in managing accounts, ordering supplies, and negotiating with the buyers who came each fall to purchase the herd for shipment east. And Patrick often said, with evident pride, that he had married not only a fine woman but the best accountant in the territory, a claim Naomi always laughingly disputed while secretly treasuring. They had a third child, a boy named Patrick after his father, born in 1886, completing a family that felt, to Naomi, impossibly full compared to the empty grief of the winter she had first opened a stranger's letter at her counter in Cottonwood Bend. Young Thomas grew tall and quiet like his mother, with a gift for numbers that had the local schoolteacher predicting great things for his future. Verna grew up fierce and clever and utterly unafraid of anyone, cowboy or banker alike, much to her great aunt's endless delight. And young Patrick, the baby, had his father's easy warmth and his mother's steady patience in equal measure, a combination that made him, from an early age, everybody's favorite among the ranch hands. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, in October of 1889, with the territory soon to become a state, Patrick surprised Naomi with a small bundle of letters tied with ribbon, and she realized with a start that he had kept every single one she had ever written to him, from the very first careful reply she had sent as nothing more than a kindness, through every letter of the courtship that followed. "I could not bear to throw any of them away," he admitted, a little sheepish, as she sat on their porch untying the ribbon with careful fingers. "I read them sometimes still, when you are out riding and the house is quiet. I like remembering the woman who wrote them, even though I have the very great fortune of living with her every day now." Naomi found the second letter near the bottom of the bundle, his own letter about the $60, worn soft at the folds from having been read so many times over the years, and she held it for a long moment, remembering the particular stillness of that night in Cottonwood Bend, when she had sat down at her table and simply not been able to get back up for the longest time, undone entirely by the discovery of a kindness given without any expectation of return. "You changed everything with this letter," she said quietly. "Do you know that? I think some part of me had already decided, before I even finished reading it, that I was going to marry you, whether or not I ever admitted such a thing to myself for months afterward." "I think some part of me decided the same thing," Patrick said, settling beside her on the porch swing he had built the summer after Verna was born. "The moment I heard those cowhands talking in the saloon about a widow keeping her chin up under more trouble than any one person should have to carry alone. I did not know your name yet. I did not know your face. But I think I already loved something about you, the idea of you, the courage of you, long before I ever wrote a single word." "That is a very fine thing to say to a woman after 10 years of marriage," Naomi said, laughing, though her eyes had grown bright with tears. "It is a very fine thing to still feel after 10 years of marriage," Patrick said, and kissed her softly, there on the porch, with the gold October light falling across the Wyoming grass exactly as it had fallen the day she first walked toward him on that train platform, exactly as it had fallen the day she first read his letter and could not, for the longest time, bring herself to stand back up. They sat together as the sun went down, the sound of their children's laughter drifting up from somewhere near the barn, old Verna's voice calling out something stern and affectionate in equal measure. The whole rich, hard-won texture of a life neither of them could have imagined on the day a stranger's letter first arrived at a dusty general store counter in Cottonwood Bend, Kansas, and a young widow, out of nothing more than simple kindness, decided to write back. It had been, Naomi thought, watching the last light fade over the land they had built together, exactly the right decision, and she would have made it again in a heartbeat, letter after letter, kindness after kindness, all the way to this porch, this man, this impossibly full and happy life, for as long as she lived and long after, in the memory of the children who would one day tell their own children the story of how their parents fell in love through the mail, one honest letter at a time. Until a second letter, about 60 quiet dollars, changed the whole shape of everything that came after. In the years that followed, the story of Patrick Walker and Naomi Wainwright became something of a local legend around Laramie and Cottonwood Bend both, told at weddings and church socials, and around winter fires when the talk turned to matters of the heart. People would say, with a certain wistful shake of the head, that it went to show a person never truly knew what small act of kindness might come back around to change a whole life, that the world was not so large or so cold a place as it sometimes seemed, so long as there remained men and women willing to write an honest letter, or answer one, simply because it seemed the right thing to do. Naomi herself, in her later years, when her own children had grown and begun to ask about how their parents had met, would tell the story simply, without much embellishment, because she found the truth of it needed none. She would tell them about the drought, and the debt, and Mr. Hargrove's cold eyes, and the letter that arrived on the very worst afternoon of that whole hard year. She would tell them about writing back only as a kindness, never expecting anything more to come of it. And she would tell them, always, about the second letter, the one about the $60 given freely to a stranger who needed it, and how she had sat down after reading it and simply not been able to get back up again for the longest time, because some truths are heavy enough to require a person to sit with them a while before they can be properly carried forward into the rest of a life. "That is when I knew," she would tell her children, and later her grandchildren, gathered around her in the warm light of the ranch house that had grown, over the decades, from a modest homestead into a sprawling, comfortable home filled with the noise and laughter of a family built on nothing more complicated, in the end, than honesty, kindness, and the simple courage of two lonely people willing to open their hearts to a stranger's words. "That is when I knew," she would say again, softer, looking toward the window where, if the hour was right and the light was falling just so, She might catch sight of Patrick out by the corral, still riding the range at an age when most men had long since handed such work over to their sons. Still every bit the man who had once ridden 3 days by train because a letter told him a woman he loved was in trouble. That is when I knew I would love that man for the rest of my life. And she had.